I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, staring blankly out the windshield as if the night would give me some kind of answer. I couldn't go back to the house. Not tonight. Not after what I'd just seen. I don't know what I'd been expecting when I walked up those stairs, but I sure wasn't ready for what was waiting for me. I'd left work early, thinking I'd surprise Rachel with takeout from that little Italian place she likes. Just a quiet night in, like old times. Lately, we'd been so busy. Me with work, her with whatever real estate deal she had going on. I thought maybe she'd like the gesture. But the second I opened the front door, I could tell something was off. There was this hush in the air. You live with someone long enough, you get a feel for the rhythm of the house, the noises and silences, what's normal and what isn't. And this wasn't normal. I heard low voices upstairs, hers and a man's. The sound of it prickled my skin. I don't know what kept me walking up those stairs. Part of me was yelling to turn around, get the hell out of there, because deep down, I already knew. But I kept going, like my feet had a mind of their own. I barely reached the top step before I heard her laugh. It wasn't a laugh meant for me. And then, like a slap to the face, I heard her say, "I wish I could stay here with you all night." I didn't stick around for the rest. I turned and walked out, barely holding it together long enough to get back to my car. Now here I was, parked on some random street with my head spinning, wondering how in the world I'd ended up here. Rachel, my wife, the woman I'd trusted with everything I had, with another man. For a while, I just sat there, letting the shock settle in. Rage and heartbreak swirled together like some kind of sick cocktail, one that left me feeling numb. I couldn't even remember the last time I felt that close to her. Had I missed something? How had I not seen this coming? Without even thinking about it, I found myself dialing Linda's number. Yeah, Linda, Rachel's mom. She was the last person I should be calling, but I didn't know who else to turn to. My family wasn't exactly the talk about your feelings type, and my friends, well, they'd be more likely to tell me to burn her clothes in the front yard than actually listen. But Linda, she'd always been there, more like a friend than a mother-in-law. She'd know what to say, or at least how to listen. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Max?" she answered, and even over the line, I could hear the warmth in her voice. She always knew when something was wrong, had that way of reading people that put me at ease. I didn't know who else to call, I said, my voice sounding rough, like I hadn't used it in days. "I don't even know where to start, Linda." There was a pause, and I heard her take a soft breath. "Max, come on over," she said gently. "You don't need to say anything right now. Just come." I nodded, forgetting for a second that she couldn't see me, then managed to croak out a quiet, "Thanks." By the time I pulled up in front of her house, my stomach was in knots. I didn't even know what I was doing here. What was I supposed to say? But Linda opened the door before I'd even knocked, standing there in her robe with that steady look in her eyes that said she'd been through storms before. She took one look at me and knew. I could see it in the way her expression softened, the way she opened her arms without a word. I didn't even realize how badly I needed it until I stepped forward and let her hug me. She held on tight, like she knew exactly what kind of wreck I was. And for a minute, it was okay not to have words. It was okay just to stand there, because someone else understood. Someone else felt the weight of what had just happened. "Come on in," she said quietly, patting my back before guiding me inside. She led me to the couch, grabbed a couple of mugs, and poured some tea, setting one in front of me. I stared at it like it was a foreign object before finally wrapping my hands around it, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. I took a deep breath, staring down at the tea, not really seeing it. "I went home early tonight, wanted to surprise her," I mumbled. But she was with someone else. Linda's hand stilled on her mug, and she looked at me with something close to heartbreak in her eyes. "Oh, Max," she murmured, and that's all she had to say. In that moment, she didn't need to give some wise answer. Just her being there, looking at me like that, it was enough to keep me grounded. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. We just sat there, the silence full of unspoken things. I wanted to ask her why it had happened, what I'd done to make Rachel go to someone else. But I couldn't bring myself to say the words. "I just don't get it," I said finally, barely above a whisper. "I thought we were solid. I thought we had a good thing. Linda reached out, her hand warm as it settled on mine. Sometimes people make choices that hurt us, Max. It's not your fault. Don't carry that. Something in her voice, that quiet strength, made my chest tighten. I felt understood, like maybe I wasn't the fool I thought I was. I looked up at her, and for the first time in hours, I felt a little less alone. The next morning, I woke up on Linda's couch, feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My mind was still a mess, and the ache in my chest hadn't let up. The shock had started wearing off, but the anger? That was starting to come in waves. It had hit me out of nowhere, the kind of anger that makes your hands shake and your jaw clench. I'd barely rubbed the sleep from my eyes when I heard Linda in the kitchen. She was humming softly, making coffee, the smell drifting into the living room like a small comfort. I sat up, trying to shake off the heaviness that had settled in me. She looked over and gave me a small smile. One of those understanding looks that let me know she wasn't about to push me to talk if I wasn't ready. But at that moment, I wanted to talk. I needed to. As she poured the coffee, I finally let it out. I just don't understand, Linda. I thought Rachel and I were. I don't know. I thought we were good. I laughed, but it came out bitter. I feel like an idiot. She slid a mug over to me and sat down across the table, her hands wrapped around her own cup. Max, you're not an idiot. You trusted her, and that's what you're supposed to do in a marriage. I shook my head, trying to keep it together. It hurts, you know? To think that maybe this whole time, I was just not enough. Linda reached out and put a hand on mine, and I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the coffee. Max, don't let her choices make you question your worth. Sometimes, people make decisions that have nothing to do with us. That doesn't make it hurt any less, but it's the truth. The way she said it, so steady, with such quiet conviction, made something in me soften. I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Rachel and I had been going through the motions, just coexisting for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to connect with someone. And here was Linda, looking at me like she actually understood the hurt I was carrying. I managed a small smile, but I couldn't hold her gaze for long. There was something about the way she was looking at me, gentle but strong, like she knew exactly what I needed, even when I didn't. Thanks, I said quietly, looking down at my coffee. I don't know if I could have gone through this alone. She squeezed my hand. You're not alone, Max. You've got me. You've got people who care about you. We stayed like that for a while, her hand resting on mine, the warmth of her touch grounding me in a way that was starting to feel dangerous. The way she looked at me, with that softness in her eyes, was stirring something in me I couldn't name. I pulled my hand away, trying to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. I pushed it aside and focused on the practical. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do next. Rachel wants to talk things through, but how do you even begin to fix something like this? Linda leaned back, crossing her arms. I can't tell you what to do, Max, but I will say this. You deserve someone who values you. Someone who doesn't make you feel like you're not enough. Her words struck a chord, a truth I'd been avoiding. I'd spent years doing everything I could to be a good husband, but somewhere along the way, Rachel had drifted. And maybe I'd been too focused on keeping things steady to realize just how far apart we'd grown. I glanced up at Linda, and for a second, I forgot everything. I forgot about Rachel, the betrayal, the hurt. All I saw was this woman sitting across from me, someone who'd been a constant source of comfort and stability. And for the first time, I saw her differently, not just as my mother-in-law, but as someone who cared about me, really cared. The thought hit me hard, but I pushed it back down, telling myself it was just the loneliness talking. But the way she looked at me, her eyes soft and full of understanding, made it hard to ignore. Max, she said gently, breaking the silence, you're going to get through this. It might not feel like it now, but you will. Her words settled over me like a blanket, warm and reassuring. For the first time since I'd walked in on Rachel, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely lost. Linda had this way of making everything feel manageable, like the storm I was in would eventually pass. I looked at her, my heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Thank you, Linda. Really. I don't know what I'd do without you. She reached over and touched my cheek, a soft, lingering touch that made my breath catch. "You don't have to thank me, Max. You're family." But the way she said it, so tender and full of something deeper, made me question what that word really meant. Family. Somehow, in this moment, it felt like more. Like she was my anchor in a sea I didn't know how to navigate. Someone who saw me, not just as Rachel's husband, but as a man who was hurting, a man who needed to be seen. And that was the moment I knew things were changing, that something between us was shifting in a way I couldn't ignore. The next few days passed in a haze. Rachel kept calling, sending messages asking to meet and work things out. I ignored every single one. I wasn't ready to face her, to even begin untangling the anger I felt just hearing her voice. But I couldn't exactly sit at home, drowning in my thoughts, either. So I found myself gravitating toward Linda's place more than I probably should have. Every night, I'd tell myself I'd just go for a quick coffee, maybe talk through what happened, but I'd always end up staying longer than I planned. Her presence felt like an anchor, something solid I could hold onto when everything else was slipping out from under me. She didn't press me for details or offer shallow reassurances. She'd just listen, her eyes steady on mine, with this calm patience that made me feel like I didn't have to hide anything. And when she'd offer her thoughts, they'd hit me deep, making me see things I hadn't let myself consider. One evening, after I'd poured out another rant about Rachel and the questions that still lingered, I sighed and leaned back on her couch, running my hands over my face. "You know what the worst part is?" I said, staring up at the ceiling. "I don't know what's real anymore. I mean, did she ever even love me? Or was I just a placeholder?" Linda watched me for a moment, and I felt her hand rest on my shoulder. "Max," she said quietly, "you don't deserve to feel this way. Sometimes people do things that hurt us, and it's not because of anything we did wrong. It's their own brokenness showing up in the worst way." Her hand lingered on my shoulder, and I felt myself leaning into her touch, almost instinctively. Her fingers were soft, comforting, and I couldn't help but close my eyes, feeling the tension in me start to fade under her touch. I turned to her, and for a moment, we just sat there, looking at each other. Something in her gaze was different, deeper, maybe. The way she looked at me, with so much care, made my pulse quicken. Her hand slipped down from my shoulder to rest on my arm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between us, something I didn't know how to handle. "You've been so good to me, Linda," I said, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "I don't know how I'd be getting through this without you." She gave me a sad smile, and I could see her eyes were a little misty. "Max, your family. I'd do anything to help you." Her words were warm, but there was something behind them, something that felt like it went beyond family. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just my own loneliness talking. But the feeling was there, hanging heavy in the air between us. Linda took a shaky breath, pulling her hand back, and the warmth of her touch left me feeling colder than I wanted to admit. "I'm just glad I can be here for you," she said, and her voice was softer now, almost as if she was holding something back. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the air thick with things we weren't saying. I knew I should probably leave, go home and get some sleep, but I couldn't make myself get up. Something about being near her made me feel settled. Like maybe I wasn't as alone in all of this as I thought. Eventually, Linda got up, clearing our mugs and moving around the kitchen, and I watched her, feeling this strange tug in my chest. I wasn't supposed to be here, feeling this way about her. This was Rachel's mother, for God's sake. But that didn't change the fact that she was the one I wanted to be near, the one whose presence made me feel wanted. Just as I was getting ready to thank her and say goodnight, she surprised me by sitting back down beside me, closer than before. Her hand reached out, covering mine again, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a hesitance, a question. "Max," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I know things have been rough, and I don't want to complicate them any further. But you need to know something." She hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "You're not alone in this. And you matter to me. More than you might realize." Her words hit me like a punch, and I felt my heart pound in my chest. I didn't know what to say, couldn't even think straight. Part of me wanted to lean in, close the space between us, but the other part of me knew that would change everything. Linda, I started, my voice barely steady. I didn't know where I was going with it, didn't know how to express this strange pull I felt toward her. She looked away, biting her lip as if she regretted saying anything. I'm sorry, Max. I don't want to make this harder for you, she murmured, and her hand started to pull away. Without thinking, I reached out and took her hand in mine, holding it firmly. No, I said, my voice rough. Don't be sorry. I didn't expect. Her eyes met mine, searching, and I felt the weight of everything unspoken between us. It was like a dam had broken, and all the emotions I'd been pushing down came rushing to the surface. The betrayal, the loneliness, the strange comfort I felt around her. All of it wrapped up in this one moment. I don't know what this is, I said finally, feeling more vulnerable than I'd been in a long time. But I know that being here with you feels right. More right than anything I've felt in a long time. She nodded, her eyes full of something I couldn't quite name. Maybe it's because we're both hurting, she said softly. But whatever this is, it's real. We sat there, our hands still linked, both of us knowing that we'd crossed a line we could never uncross. And yet, in that moment, it didn't feel wrong. It felt like the one thing I could hold on to, the one thing that made sense in the middle of all the chaos. When I finally pulled myself away and said goodnight, I knew things between us would never be the same. The air was thick with something electric, something that left me awake long into the night, wondering just how far down this road I was willing to go, and what it would mean for both of us. For the next few days, I tried to shake off the weight of that night with Linda, but it clung to me, just as strong as the memory of Rachel's betrayal. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Linda's face, her eyes soft, her hand warm in mine, that small smile that seemed meant just for me. I was haunted by all the things we hadn't said, but had somehow felt in every touch, every glance. I hadn't planned on seeing her again so soon, but when I got home after work one night, my apartment felt hollow, like I was walking into an empty shell of the life I used to know. Rachel's things were still there, reminders of a love that had shattered, and no matter where I turned, I couldn't escape them. The ache in my chest was unbearable, and before I knew it, I was back in the car, driving to Linda's. When she opened the door, her face softened. She didn't ask why I was there or say anything to make it harder. She just stepped aside, letting me in, and I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. It was like she could sense everything I was feeling without a single word. We settled into the living room, both of us quieter than usual, the air thick with an unspoken understanding. Linda handed me a glass of wine, and for a while, we just sat there in silence, the only sounds coming from the occasional clink of glass as we sipped. Eventually, she looked at me, her eyes searching, and I felt the same pull I had felt that night on her couch. Max, she said softly, I'm glad you came by. I know this can't be easy for you. I nodded, not trusting my voice. I could feel my pulse picking up, every inch of me suddenly more aware of her than I had been of anyone in a long time. She sighed, looking down at her glass. I don't want you to feel like you can't come here, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't want you to think you're alone, either. I care about you, Max, more than I should. Her words hung in the air between us, and I couldn't hold back anymore. I reached over, covering her hand with mine, and she looked up, her eyes wide, vulnerable. I could feel my heart pounding, feel the warmth of her skin under my fingertips, and suddenly, the space between us seemed unbearably small. Linda, I started, my voice low and rough. This connection between us, I know it's not what either of us planned, but it's real. You're the one person who's been there for me through all this, and I don't know what I'd do without you. She didn't pull away, and the look in her eyes softened, her expression torn between hesitation and something deeper. Max, this is so complicated, she whispered, her voice wavering. You're my son-in-law, and I'm supposed to be there for Rachel too. But right now, all I can think about is you. Her words were like a release, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, my lips finding hers. For a second, she froze, but then I felt her soften against me, her hands coming up to my shoulders, pulling me closer. The kiss was slow, hesitant, but there was a depth to it, a mix of loneliness, comfort, and something that felt almost like a silent promise. We pulled apart slowly, both of us catching our breath, and I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Max," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't. We shouldn't." I nodded, but I didn't let go of her hand. "I know," I said, my voice thick with everything I couldn't say. "But it doesn't change how I feel. I can't ignore this, whatever this is between us. And I don't think you can either." She looked away, her cheeks flushed, but she didn't pull her hand from mine. "I don't want to hurt you, Max," she said softly, "but I'm afraid we're both heading into something that could end badly." Her words hit me, but they didn't change how I felt. If anything, they made me want to hold on to her more, to keep this strange, fragile connection alive despite the consequences. "I'd rather take the risk than spend the rest of my life wondering what this could have been," I said, the conviction in my voice surprising even me. We sat there in silence, both of us knowing that this wasn't a decision either of us could take lightly. But the pull between us was too strong to ignore, and in that moment, it felt like she was the only person in the world who understood me, who saw me in my brokenness and still wanted to be there. The night passed with soft words, hesitant glances, and the warmth of her touch grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I could feel myself falling deeper and deeper, even though I knew this wasn't the kind of love that came without a cost. When I finally left, I felt a strange mixture of hope and fear, a quiet excitement tempered by the nagging thought that we were on the edge of something neither of us could take back. But as I walked to my car, her hand still lingering in my mind, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened, I couldn't go back to the life I had before. Linda had become more than just a source of comfort. She was my refuge, my anchor, my second chance at feeling something real. And no matter how complicated it got, I knew I wasn't ready to let that go. The days after that kiss with Linda were filled with a strange, simmering tension. I felt a pull to see her again, and yet every time I thought about it, guilt and doubt gnawed at me. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the softness of her lips, the warmth of her hand in mine. And yet I knew that this wasn't some passing mistake. This was real, and that meant it couldn't be ignored. Rachel kept calling, leaving voicemails filled with apologies and pleas to talk things out. But after what had happened between Linda and me, I couldn't bear to face her. The betrayal felt even sharper now. I kept asking myself what I'd ever seen in Rachel to begin with. Had I been fooling myself this whole time? Eventually, though, I knew I couldn't avoid Rachel forever. I had to go back to the house, if only to face her and decide what came next. When I arrived, Rachel was waiting in the kitchen, looking pale and anxious. The sight of her, after everything, felt like a knife twisting in my chest. She stood up as I walked in, her eyes red and filled with regret, but I couldn't find an ounce of sympathy in me. "Max," she started, her voice small, barely above a whisper. "Please, let's talk." I crossed my arms, feeling a cold detachment settle over me. "Talk about what, Rachel?" "About how you threw everything we had away." She flinched, and I saw a flash of anger in her eyes. "It wasn't like that, Max. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but I didn't mean to hurt you." I laughed, bitter and low. "Didn't mean to hurt me? You know, I used to think we had something real, something that couldn't be broken by something as cheap as this." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she looked like the woman I used to love. But it didn't change anything. She betrayed me, and no amount of apologies would erase that. "What do you want from me, Max?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, to make us work again." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. I wanted to yell, to scream that it was too late. But the truth was, it wasn't just about her betrayal anymore. Things had changed inside me, and I wasn't the same man I'd been before. "Rachel," I said finally, my voice quieter, almost resigned. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix. I don't even know if I want to fix it." Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but it quickly passed. She'd made her choice, and I was making mine. That night, I found myself back at Linda's house. I hadn't planned on going there, but as soon as I left, it was like there was only one place I could go. When she opened the door, I saw the concern in her eyes, and before I knew it, I was inside. Her arms wrapped around me in a tight embrace. "Max," she whispered, her voice full of understanding, "you don't have to go through this alone." Her words broke something in me, and I held on to her like a lifeline. There was no judgment in her touch, no questions, just the quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone in all this, that I still had someone I could trust. We moved to the couch, and as the night wore on, our conversations drifted from the pain of the past to the warmth of the present. The weight of what we were doing was there, but in her presence, it felt distant, as if this small bubble of comfort and intimacy was the only real thing in my world. Eventually, our words faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of our breathing. And as I looked at her, the same spark from the other night flickered between us. This time, there was no hesitation. We came together in a rush, a need that had been building for days, maybe even years. There was a fierceness in our connection, an urgency that I'd never felt before, like we were both clinging to something real, something that made sense in a world that had lost all meaning. Afterward, we lay in the quiet, our hands intertwined, neither of us saying a word. I knew this changed everything. There was no going back to who I'd been before, no going back to Rachel or the life we'd built. Linda had become more than just a comfort. She was the person I felt I'd been waiting for all along. But as the sun rose and the reality of the morning set in, I felt the weight of everything settle over us like a shroud. What we had was real, but it was also complicated, tangled in layers of family ties and social boundaries we could never fully escape. Linda turned to me, her face a mixture of warmth and worry. "Max, where do we go from here?" I squeezed her hand, wishing I had an easy answer. "I don't know, but I know I can't go back to the life I had. Not after this." She nodded, her expression pained but understanding. "I just don't want to see you hurt again," she said softly. "I care about you too much for that." In that moment, I knew that whatever path lay ahead, it would be a hard one. But I was willing to face it, to face whatever came next, as long as I could hold on to this feeling. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt like I'd found something real, something worth fighting for. The next morning, the weight of what Linda and I had done settled over me like a lead blanket. I had barely slept, my mind circling around what this all meant for me, for her, for Rachel. We'd crossed a line there was no coming back from, and though I'd known that last night, the reality of it hit differently in the cold light of day. Linda had drifted off beside me at some point, but her eyes opened as soon as I started to stir. She looked at me, a trace of worry behind her warmth, as if she was bracing herself for whatever I'd say. "Max," her voice was a gentle murmur. She reached out, her fingers grazing my shoulder, grounding me. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple, because it isn't. But I don't regret it. Not one bit." I searched her face, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. Knowing that she didn't regret last night softened the knot in my chest, but it didn't dissolve it. "Linda, what we have, it's real. I know that. But it's complicated." She nodded slowly, her hand sliding down to hold mine. "I know. I feel it too. We both have people in our lives who are bound to get hurt, and we can't ignore that." The truth of her words hit hard. Rachel might have been the one to betray me first, but what Linda and I had done wasn't something anyone would understand. The thought of facing Rachel, of trying to explain this, left a sinking feeling in my stomach. And it wasn't just about her. There were family ties and friendships tangled up in this, and every step forward felt like stepping into a minefield. We spent the morning talking, hashing through all the tangled emotions. There was so much Linda wanted to tell me, so much I'd wanted to say to her. We both knew what was between us wasn't something we could ignore, but we also knew that it came with a cost. Eventually, I forced myself to head back home, where I knew Rachel would be waiting. I'd barely walked through the door before she was there, a guarded look on her face. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice sharp, but there was something fragile underneath. I thought you said you'd stay to talk things over." I sighed, meeting her gaze evenly. Rachel, there's no point in pretending anymore. We're past the point of fixing things. My words hung heavy in the air, and I watched her face crumble, her expression moving from anger to hurt and finally settling into something unreadable. So that's it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. You're just going to walk away? I felt a pang of sympathy for her, even now. Despite everything, I had loved her once, and the memory of that love made this moment harder than I'd expected. I can't stay, Rachel. You made a choice, and so did I. We both know this isn't something we can just undo. She didn't try to argue, didn't plead for a second chance this time. She just looked at me with a strange sort of resignation, as if she'd known this was coming all along. And who have you been with, Max? Because I know you haven't been staying alone. Her words struck a nerve, and I struggled to keep my composure. She knew, or at least she suspected, but I couldn't bring myself to say it, not when the truth would only cause more hurt. It doesn't matter, Rachel, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. What matters is that we're done. You and I, we're not the same people we were. And it's time we faced that. She didn't push for more answers, and in that moment, it was like the last thread binding us had finally snapped. We stood there in silence, two people who had once shared a life, now strangers to each other. Later that evening, after Rachel had left, I went back to Linda's. I didn't even have to say anything when she opened the door. She saw it in my face, the weight of everything I'd left behind, and she pulled me into her arms, holding me close. Did you tell her? She asked softly, her voice muffled against my shoulder. I shook my head, feeling a pang of guilt. No, she knows, or at least she suspects. But there was no point in dragging you into it. Linda pulled back, her expression unreadable. Max, we can't keep this a secret forever. Sooner or later, people will find out, and we have to be ready for that. I nodded, knowing she was right, but still feeling the weight of it all. This wasn't just about Rachel anymore. There were family ties, friendships, connections that would all be affected by what we had done. And yet, as I looked into Linda's eyes, I knew that none of that changed how I felt. She was the one I wanted to be with, the one who had been there when everything else fell apart. We spent the night together, talking about what our lives might look like if we pursued this, if we risked the fallout. And while the road ahead looked anything but easy, we both knew that we were in it together, no matter what came next. By the time the sun rose, I felt a strange sense of peace, as if I had finally let go of the life I'd been clinging to for so long. Linda was there, her hand warm in mine, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There were still confrontations to come, truths that would have to be faced. But whatever happened, I was ready to stand by Linda, to build a new life out of the ruins of the old one. Because at the end of it all, I realized that she was my second chance. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let fear keep me from what I wanted. In the days that followed, things began to shift quickly. Word spread, and soon enough, people started putting together the pieces, whispers finding their way back to Rachel. She called me one last time, but I let it go to voicemail. Whatever there was left to say between us had already been said. She had her path to walk now, and I had mine. Being with Linda didn't erase the pain I felt or the scars left by everything we'd been through. But with her, life felt grounded, real. We didn't have to pretend. We knew the risks we'd taken, the bridges we'd crossed and burned. But in the quiet moments, with her hand in mine, I felt like I'd finally found a piece I hadn't known I was missing. Not everyone took it well, of course. Friends we'd shared with Rachel, family members with their opinions. It was a lot to navigate. But as the initial shock wore off, I realized that I was ready to face all of it. I'd spent too long living in the shadow of expectations, holding onto a marriage that had become more of a weight than a partnership. What Linda and I had now, as complicated as it was, felt like it had a foundation, a chance to be something lasting. I remember the first time we went out together, as ourselves. It was a quiet evening in a little place where nobody knew us, just the two of us sharing a meal, hands clasped across the table. Linda's laugh, her warmth, her honesty. It made everything else fade into the background. We weren't hiding, we weren't pretending, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. As the weeks went on, I started seeing things more clearly. Rachel had been a big part of my life, but she wasn't my entire life. I'd tied so much of myself to who I thought I was supposed to be with her that I'd lost sight of who I actually was. In breaking away, in facing the mess and heartache head-on, I felt like I'd found myself again. One evening, as Linda and I sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I finally felt ready to put the past behind me. I took her hand, feeling the familiar comfort in her touch, and leaned in closer. "I don't know where this will go," I said quietly, my voice steady. "But I'm here with you, and that's all I need." She looked at me, her eyes soft and filled with that same quiet understanding that had drawn me to her from the start. "I don't need promises, Max," she replied. "Just be here. That's all I ask." And so, that's what we did. We took each day as it came, not rushing, not pushing for anything beyond the present moment. Our lives had been upended, reshaped, and nothing looked the way it once had. But as I held her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against mine, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was what I'd been searching for all along. There were still days when the shadows of the past crept in, moments of doubt and whispers from others that tried to pull me back. But Linda and I held on to each other, steady through the storm. Our journey wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough for me. In the end, I learned that life has a funny way of pushing you toward the truth, even if it means tearing down everything you thought you knew. And sometimes, when the dust settles, you find something better waiting for you on the other side. For me, that something was Linda, and for the first time, I knew I wasn't going to let it slip away.